Imagine waking up tomorrow, going to your normal job, putting in a completely grueling day of work, and when you finally get paid, you have to hand over like 80% of your earnings just to buy a single loaf of bread.
Right. Just one loaf.
Exactly. You have absolutely zero margin for error.
Right.
Like if you get sick, you starve. If your cart breaks down, you starve.
Yeah, it's a terrifying scenario.
It really is. And in the late 18th century, that was the actual visceral, terrifying reality for the working class in Paris. And it's actually the perfect entry point for what we're unpacking today. So welcome to this deep dive.
Thanks. I'm really excited to get into this one.
Me too. Today, for everyone listening, we are pulling apart this really fascinating set of notes, exploring what happens when a society doesn't just, hit an economic rough patch, but completely runs out of runway.
And that is a really crucial distinction to make right up front. Because, we are all deeply conditioned to view economic crises like a swinging pendulum.
Right, the whole boom and bust cycle.
Exactly. We expect that even if the economy swings wildly into the red, gravity will eventually pull it back to the center. We trust the physics of the pendulum to return us to equilibrium.
Right.
But the historical mechanics we are looking at today from the sources, they completely challenge that comforting assumption. They introduce a scenario categorized as a 9.5 out of 10 systemic risk.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because I have to admit, when I first came across that phrase in the text in 9.5 systemic risk, my immediate reaction was, well, that sounds like apocalyptic sci-fi,
Yeah, it definitely sounds like hyperbole.
It does. But the core argument here is that a 9.5 scenario is not just a really wide swing of the economic pendulum. It's the exact moment the pendulum just snaps completely off its hinge.
Yes.
The terminology the source uses from complexity science is a discontinuous structural rollover, which is a mouthful. So to ground this for the listener, what does that actually mean? Like, what is physically happening to a society in that exact moment?
Well, to understand the mechanism, you really have to strip away the politics for a second and look at society as two distinct overlapping layers.
Okay.
So on the top layer, you have the abstract matrix. This is our software. It's the legal system, the financial ledgers, the political debates, the currency, all of that.
Right, the rules we all kind of agree to play by.
Exactly. And then underneath that, you have the hardware. And the hardware is the brutal, unyielding physical laws of supply and demand. Calories, fuel, water, raw materials.
So it's basically like a computer system.
Yes, precisely.
Like a normal recession is just a glitch in the software. You can patch it, you can reboot the system, write some new code. But a structural rollover is when the physical motherboard literally catches fire.
That is a highly accurate way to frame it. You can push all the software updates you want, but if the hardware is literally melting, the code is completely meaningless.
Right. It doesn't matter what the screen says.
Exactly. So a discontinuous structural rollover happens when the abstract matrix of an economy violently collides with a massive deficit in physical reality. The abstract rules they stop mapping to the physical resources.
And the mechanisms of societal coordination just snap.
Yeah, they break down completely.
Wow. And to really understand how fast that motherboard can melt, we have to look at how this collision actually plays out on the ground. Which brings us to our first historical case study.
Revolutionary France.
Right. Roughly between 1789 and 1792. Because this period shows what happens when a highly sophisticated abstract political debate slams face first into a wall of physical starvation.
Yeah, it's a phenomenal test case for this concept in the text known as the narrative dissonance index.
Narrative dissonance index. Okay, what is that?
It measures the gap between the stories the ruling class is telling themselves, right, and the actual physical reality experienced by the general population. And in early 1789, that gap in France was staggering.
Let's talk about that gap. Because I think a lot of people assume the French Revolution started with starving people immediately storming the gates. But the initial unrest didn't look like that at all.
No, not at all.
It started as what the text calls a luxury protest phase. The pressure on the French crown was actually coming from the elite and the upper middle class. We're talking about lawyers, reformist nobles, writers.
Sitting in gorgeous Parisian salons.
Exactly. Sitting around, debating high-minded Enlightenment concepts. They wanted to rewrite the Constitution and place legal limits on the king. So at this point, they're basically arguing over the terms of service while the system is still running, right?
Yes, which is a classic hallmark of a society that truly believes its abstract matrix is still fully functional.
Right.
The political class becomes totally obsessed with tweaking the terms of service, completely unaware that the servers are about to go down permanently. They were experiencing profound narrative dissonance.
But I'm trying to picture this transition, though, because they are arguing about legal syntax, and then suddenly the Overton window, the range of acceptable political behavior, it just shatters.
Yeah, it completely breaks apart.
And it didn't shatter because someone wrote a really persuasive legal pamphlet. How do we go from salon debates to total systemic collapse so fast?
Well, it comes down to the lack of structural slack. You see, the French state was already spending over 50% of its revenue exclusively on servicing existing debt.
Wow. Half their money.
Half, just on the interest. So they had absolutely no financial buffer. And then that massive fiscal vulnerability collided with a catastrophic harvest failure.
Which means no food. And if 50% of your income is just going to interest payments, that leaves you completely paralyzed when a real physical shock hits.
Completely paralyzed. The state couldn't subsidize grain, and the resulting hyperinflationary pressure on basic goods was immediate.
And that is how you get to the horrifying metric we talked about at the start.
Yes, exactly. Where a single loaf of bread costs 80% of a working class daily wage. And when that happens, the sophisticated ideologues, the lawyers and the nobles, they're instantly rendered irrelevant.
Because you can't eat a new constitution.
Right.
Momentum was just violently hijacked by the urban destitute class, the sans-culottes. The source calls this the activation of the zero-margin class.
Yes. Constitutional syntax didn't matter anymore. Only caloric survival did.
But I want to push back on what happened next, or at least play devil's advocate, because when a government faces a massive violent uprising, the standard playbook is just to send in the military, right? Clear the streets, restore order.
Right.
The French crown tried that, but it backfired spectacularly. Why didn't military force work in this 9.5 scenario?
Because the crown fundamentally misunderstood the physical layer of their own society. The working class in Paris wasn't just some random mob roaming the streets. They were deeply embedded inside the city's logistics. In fact, they were the logistics network.
Right. They are the people actually driving the carts, managing the warehouses, unloading the barges on the river.
Exactly. And if you deploy military force against the very people who physically operate your supply chain, you were effectively severing your own arteries.
Wow. So they just shut it down.
The workers didn't just fight back, yeah? They seized the arms depots and completely stopped coordinating with royal administrators. The military couldn't be fed, they couldn't be moved or supplied.
So the state's infrastructure didn't just get conquered, it dissolved.
It evaporated. The people running the physical machines simply refused to plug into the abstract matrix anymore.
Okay, so France is this terrifying example of a sudden, unpredictable shock, like a bad harvest triggering a debt trap that causes a localized explosion in the capital.
Right.
But what happens if a collapse isn't a surprise? What if a society has decades or even centuries to see the cliff approaching? Do they engineer their way out of it, or do they just, I don't know, find new ways to deceive themselves?
That is the big question. And it brings us perfectly to our second historical focus from the source, ancient Rome, specifically the crisis of the 3rd century.
Okay, so we're shifting from a sudden agricultural shock to the slow-burning exhaustion of an empire.
Yes, driven by a massive psychological blind spot at the leadership level. There is a concept from neurology that the text applies here, and it fits the Roman leadership perfectly. It's called anosognosia.
Yeah, I had to really wrap my head around that term when I was reading the notes, because in a medical context, anosognosia is when a patient has a severe disability, like a paralyzed limb, but their brain is cognitively incapable of recognizing that the paralysis exists.
Right, they literally cannot see the deficit.
So how does an entire empire suffer from a neurological blind spot?
Well, it happens when a leadership class relies on past resilience to ignore current decay. For centuries, Rome had vast amounts of structural slack.
Great.
If there was a poor harvest in Italy, the abstract matrix functioned perfectly. They just requisitioned more grain from Egypt.
Or if there was a border incursion, they just deployed extra legions.
Exactly. They used these negative feedback loops to absorb shocks and return the pendulum back to the center.
But by the mid-200s AD, that slack was entirely consumed by these relentless, compounding border wars. Maintaining the empire just became exponentially more expensive.
And the physical treasury was basically empty.
Right. And here's where it gets really interesting, and honestly kind of familiar, because the emperors did exactly what the text says modern central banks do today. They tried to solve physical deficits with mathematical tricks.
Yes, the anosognosia kicks in.
Let's unpack the specific trick they used. To fund these mounting military costs, a succession of Roman emperors deliberately debased the currency. They took the Roman denarius and systematically reduced the actual silver content in the coins so they could mint millions more of them.
They were essentially printing money they didn't have.
Exactly, creating money out of thin air to cover their deficits.
Now, I'm trying to remain impartial here and just stick to the text's historical comparison, but why does this trigger what the source calls the coercion feedback loop? Modern economies manage inflation all the time. Why did this uniquely break the Roman Empire?
The difference really lies in the complexity of the financial system backing the currency. Today, fiat currency is backed by incredibly complex legal and economic structures. But in Rome, the value of the coin was strictly tied to the physical scarcity of the metal itself.
Right, it had to actually be silver.
Exactly. And you cannot trick the physical laws of supply and demand for long. When the merchants realized the new coins had basically no silver, they demanded more coins for the same amount of grain.
Which means hyperinflation spikes.
Spikes rapidly, and suddenly the working class is completely priced out of survival again.
So people start starving, and naturally, they protest. But the emperors, again, blinded by this anosognosia, they didn't perceive these protests as a rational response to starvation. They viewed them as a direct challenge to their dominance. Political treason.
Wow, so they doubled down.
They doubled down.
Yeah.
Their response was the coercion feedback loop. They launched brutal military crackdowns to literally force merchants to accept these worthless coins at sword point.
So imagine being a Roman beggar. A soldier tells you to hand over a real loaf of bread for a copper coin that's just been painted to look like silver.
Right.
And if you refuse, you are killed. So what do? You don't take the coin. You stop baking. You hide your grain.
And that is exactly how the physical contract of the empire was broken. Because Rome could no longer afford to fund the actual grain dole, the free bread giveaways that kept the urban poor pacified, the population just simply stopped cooperating.
They realized the central government was no longer providing security. It was an active threat. And this leads to a really gritty physical reality on the ground, because the fracture of Rome wasn't a centralized explosion like Paris, right?
Right.
It was this massive decentralized decay.
Right.
The source describes how trucking and shipping routes became too dangerous to navigate. Banditry spiked. So society just fractured into these hyper-local, autarkic survival nodes.
Autarkic meaning entirely self-sufficient.
Right.
Every node is forced to survive without any external trade or imperial support.
Right. Wealthy landowners just fled the chaotic cities, moved to their rural estates, and built walls. Local municipalities stopped sending taxes to Rome because they needed the money to defend themselves locally.
Yeah. The imperial footprint was violently scrubbed out by its own citizens.
They looked at the central government and said, "You are a liability." It's essentially the messy, hyperlocal birth of feudalism.
It really is. And it highlights a core mechanic of a phase shift. The abstract matrix of the Roman Empire, its laws, its currency, its demands for tribute, it was simply rejected in favor of hyperlocal caloric security.
So Rome decays because it loses control of its money and its physical borders. It's a decentralized unspooling. But this raises a huge question about modern statecraft.
Okay.
What if a government has absolute centralized authoritarian control? Like, what if they don't just debase the currency, but they dictate every single price, control every factory's output, and own all the media?
Oh, I see where you're going.
Right. Can you force a society to keep running through sheer authoritarian willpower, even if the foundation is totally rotting?
Well, that brings us to our final historical exploration from the text. The late Soviet Union, specifically from roughly 1989 to 1991.
Yeah.
The Soviet collapse is perhaps the most chilling example here, because it demonstrates the terrifying velocity of a 9.5 economic degradation in a modern, industrialized nuclear superpower.
Wow.
It really reveals what happens when a ruling class relies entirely on an enforced narrative of normalcy.
Let's set the scene in the 1980s, because the Soviet leadership class was living entirely inside a fabricated reality.
Yes, they were.
They managed the empire through a world of pure spreadsheets, 5-year production targets, and heavily manipulated data. The official state ledger recorded record industrial output, 0 unemployment.
Robust economic health.
Exactly. It was a massive, state-enforced Potemkin ledger, as the source calls it.
A facade designed to hide the structural decay. But unlike the original Potemkin villages that were designed to fool a visiting monarch, the Soviet ruling class built this ledger to deceive themselves.
Right.
They were structurally insulated from the physical realities of their own empire.
It reminds me of a corporation where the accounting looks absolutely flawless on paper. The quarterly reports are stunning, margins are climbing, the CEO is giving these incredibly confident keynote speeches.
Yeah,
But if you walk out of the boardroom and down to the actual physical warehouse, the shelves are completely bare. The physical boundary of the system had already been breached.
that's a perfect analogy. The Soviet system had spent decades systematically misallocating its resources into heavy industry and military expansion at the total expense of basic consumer goods.
Right.
And whatever structural slack they had left was completely obliterated by two colliding forces. First, a sudden, severe crash in global oil prices, which they relied on heavily for hard currency.
Oh, wow.
And second, a bleeding-edge, deeply unpopular military misadventure in Afghanistan.
So the warehouse is basically completely empty, but the leaders in Moscow are still reading the flawless spreadsheets.
Exactly.
Now, the mechanism that breaks down here is described in the text as the transmission lag dropping to zero. And I want to understand what that actually means in human terms. Because normally, if a central bank makes a bad policy decision today, it takes months for the average consumer to really feel the inflation.
Right, there's a buffer.
Exactly. So what does a zero transmission lag actually look like for an average citizen walking down the street in Kyiv or Moscow in 1989?
Well, when transmission lag drops to zero, that buffer between abstract state failure and physical human suffering completely vanishes.
Wow.
You don't read an op-ed about an economic downturn. You feel it in your stomach by that afternoon. For the Soviet citizen, this manifested as the sudden, ubiquitous reality of endless, soul-crushing lines.
And not for luxury goods, right?
No, for the absolute baselines of human existence. Soap, bread, sugar, shoes. The abstract matrix of Soviet communism had completely failed to deliver basic hygiene and calories.
And just like the French crown and just like the Roman emperors, the central government in Moscow eventually realized they were losing control and resorted to brute force.
Always the brute force.
Right. In August 1991, hardliners in the government attempted a coup. They sent tanks into the streets to forcefully restore order and demand compliance from the physical layer of society. But instead of restoring order, this military crackdown triggered a massive positive feedback loop.
Which is critical to understand. In complexity theory, a negative feedback loop stabilizes a system like, sweating to lower your body temperature.
Right.
But a positive feedback loop amplifies the chaos and accelerates the collapse. The harder the Soviet center squeezed with military force, the faster the regional nodes fragmented.
And this is where we encounter a highly specific concept from the source to describe this ultimate state of fragmentation. 8-to-8 regime physics.
Yes.
I was looking at this term, and honestly, it sounds like a chess strategy or some kind of grid logic puzzle. What do those numbers actually represent when we are talking about a superpower disintegrating?
Well, you're actually spot on. Think of it exactly like an 8x8 grid on a chessboard.
Yeah, okay.
In a healthy, functioning system, the pieces move across the entire board. Information, resources, and authority flow freely from one edge to the other.
Right.
But when 8-to-8 regime physics take over, the system reaches the state of total, localized gridlock. The board essentially shatters into 64 isolated squares. A node only cares about itself and its immediate neighbors. The king can issue all the commands he wants from the center square, but the pawns on the edge of the board simply do not recognize his authority anymore. They are entirely focused on preserving the remaining resources inside their own specific square.
So the local mayor in a Siberian mining town or the manager of a municipal distribution hub in Ukraine, they just stop answering the phone when Moscow calls?
Precisely. They issue declarations of non-cooperation. And they don't necessarily declare a violent civil war. They just embrace extreme localized apathy.
They just tune it out.
Yeah. They keep their own grain, they hoard their own fuel, and they treat central directives as completely irrelevant background noise.
Man, when you step back and look at the sheer scale of that, it is mind-bending. I mean, a global superpower with a massive standing army, a terrifying intelligence apparatus, and thousands of nuclear weapons collapsed in a matter of weeks. Not because they were invaded by a foreign army, but because the local authorities decided the physical needs of their communities overrode the abstract commands of the empire.
It is the ultimate manifestation of a discontinuous structural rollover. When the physics of an 8-to-8 regime take hold, the official currency is rejected, The logistics network freezes because the operators are striking for food, and survival shrinks down to the hyperlocal level.
Okay, so let's pull all of this together for the listener. Across revolutionary France, ancient Rome, and the late Soviet Union, we're basically looking at the exact same 9.5 phase shift, just manifesting in different ways based on the technology of the time.
Exactly. The pendulum doesn't swing back into the green. The hinge simply gives way.
When a society burns through its physical slack and its leaders suffer from that cognitive blindness, that anosognosia, the abstract matrix, violently collides with the physical realities of supply and demand.
Mhm.
And physical reality wins every single time.
Every single time. Which honestly leaves us with a critical and frankly unsettling question to ponder. One that you, listening to this, really need to weigh against your own observations of the world today.
Okay, let's hear it.
Look at our modern, highly digitized society. Do our invisible technical workarounds, our complex financial instruments, and our algorithmic supply chains give us the unique ability to somehow delay this kind of catastrophic phase shift?
Or,
Or does our extreme just-in-time dependency, a global system relentlessly optimized for maximum efficiency with almost zero structural slack, mean that our modern sandpile is actually far more volatile than the empires of the past?
wow, if the hardware catches fire, the software doesn't matter.
Ex-
That is a question that is going to keep me up at night, for sure. And I hope it gives you plenty to chew on as you navigate the news this week. Remember, the pendulum always feels perfectly safe right up until the exact moment the hinge gives way. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the mechanics of societal phase shifts. Keep questioning the underlying mechanics of the world around you, and we'll catch you next time.